Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. Today, we're looking at the tragic case of Atul Subhash, a software engineer in Bengaluru who committed suicide recently. And we're trying to figure out exactly what happened. We have two news sources to help piece this whole story together. What makes this case so interesting is all the unusual stuff around his death. We're talking a 24-page suicide note and an 80-minute-long video message, not to mention some really serious accusations of harassment.
Yeah, it's definitely a situation that needs a closer look. There's a lot to unpack here.
For sure. So let's start by understanding who this guy Atul Subhash actually was. What do we know about him before all this happened?
Well, from what we've gathered, he was a 34-year-old software engineer, originally from Uttar Pradesh, but he had been working in Bengaluru. Seemed like he was building a life for himself there. He got married in 2019, had a son in 2020. But things took a turn, and he separated from his wife in 2021.
So on the surface, a young professional with a family, but clearly something else was going on beneath the surface.
Absolutely. And tragically, those struggles came to an end on December 9th, when he was found dead in his apartment. Cause of death was ruled a suicide by hanging up out.
It's just so sad to think about what happened that day, especially knowing that he left a note behind that just said justice is due. It makes you wonder what was going through his mind in those final moments.
It really does. Those two words are just so haunting. And speak to the despair he must have been feeling. Police have confirmed that there were problems in his marriage, and he was living alone, which adds yet another layer to this tragedy.
Definitely. Speaking of wanting to be heard, let's talk about that 24-page suicide note and the 80-minute video. He posted that on Rumble before his death. He clearly wanted to make sure people knew his story. He emailed that note to a bunch of different people and even sent it to a WhatsApp group for an NGO. This wasn't just a private message. This was a message to the world.
Yeah, you're right. It seems like he really wanted to get his side of the story out. And he's pretty direct in those messages about who he blames for what happened. He names his estranged wife, her family, and even a judge in Uttar Pradesh as the reasons why he decided to take his own life.
Wow, that's heavy stuff. It's hard to imagine what would drive someone to that point. He specifically says his wife filed multiple legal cases against him, and that the stress of all that is what pushed him over the edge.
It wasn't just the emotional stress either. He says she was harassing him for money, demanding huge sums of money, even though she was already getting 40,000 rupees a month in maintenance payments.
And that's where this case gets even more complicated. He expresses this fear that any money he makes will just be used against him and against his family. He felt trapped in this cycle of harassment. It really gives you a sense of how hopeless he must have felt.
It really does. He felt like the system that should be protecting him was actually being used against him. He talks about the courts and the police as just another tool for harassment, fueled by his own hard-earned money.
That's a powerful and disturbing image. It speaks to a complete loss of faith in the system. He mentions that his wife had a job at Accenture and her own income, yet she was still demanding an extra 2 to 4 lakh rupees. That's a huge amount of money. What did he think her motives were?
Well, in his note, he describes these financial demands as exploitation. He felt like she was just trying to bleed him dry. He saw it as a personal attack, not just a financial disagreement.
So it wasn't just about the money itself, it was the feeling of being targeted and treated unfairly.
Precisely. And this brings us to the legal side of things. Atul's family filed a first information report, or FIR, with the police after his death. They're accusing his wife and her family of abetment of suicide, which is a pretty serious charge in India.
It is a serious charge. But how often do those charges actually stick in cases like this? What do they have to prove to make that charge hold up?
It's not easy to prove abetment. You have to show that the accused person had a clear intention of pushing the victim to suicide. It's still under investigation, and no one has been arrested yet.
So it's a very delicate situation that needs to be looked at carefully. It seems like the Indian legal system and how it handles domestic disputes is becoming a focal point in this whole case.
Yeah, definitely. Atul's case is raising some big questions about whether the system is equipped to handle these situations, especially when you factor in mental health. His story is blown up on social media, and it's starting a conversation about whether there's enough support for people going through similar challenges.
That's a crucial point. What are some of the concerns people are raising about how the legal system is dealing with these types of cases?
One of the biggest concerns is the emotional toll these legal battles take on people. The process can be long and stressful. It can really wear you down and make any mental health issues you have even worse.
It's like you're stuck in this whirlwind of legal procedures and financial stress and emotional turmoil, all while you're trying to deal with the breakdown of your marriage.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's where the mental health conversation becomes even more critical. Was there enough support available for Atul when he was going through all this? Could earlier intervention have prevented this tragedy?
These are tough questions that need to be asked. Atul's story seems to be highlighting a much bigger problem that goes beyond just his individual case.
You're absolutely right. It's about recognizing that there might be systemic issues at play here that are contributing to these tragedies, and we need to find ways to prevent them from happening again. Atul's case is also bringing up a lot of discussion about societal pressures, especially the pressures men face in these kinds of situations. It's not something we talk about enough.
I agree. There's this expectation that men should just deal with things on their own, be stoic and not show any vulnerability.
Exactly. And that can create a really dangerous environment where men feel isolated and don't feel like they can ask for help. They're afraid of being judged or seen as weak.
So they end up suffering in silence, holding all that pain inside, which can lead to tragic outcomes like what happened with Atul.
Right. And we have to acknowledge that there aren't a lot of resources out there specifically for men who are going through these kinds of challenges. That's something we need to change as a society.
It's about recognizing that everyone needs support, men and women,
Yeah.
especially when they're dealing with mental health issues on top of personal and legal battles.
Absolutely. And this brings us back to mental health, which is at the heart of this whole case. Atul's story really highlights the desperate need for better mental health awareness and better support systems.
You can tell from his suicide note and that video message that he was really struggling. He talked about feeling isolated and misunderstood and ultimately hopeless.
His words are a stark reminder that we need to pay attention to the warning signs and do more to help people who might be going through something like this.
I keep thinking about that note he left behind. Just those two words, justice is due. It wasn't an explanation, it was more like a statement. Like he wanted his death to be a final accusation.
Yeah, that's a powerful way to put it. It shows how deeply he felt he'd been wronged by the very systems that should have been there to protect him.
He also said in his note that he didn't want his family to scatter his ashes until the people he accused were punished. That's a really heartbreaking detail. It shows just how much he wanted justice.
That request really emphasizes how deeply those legal battles affected him. It consumed his thoughts right up until the very end. It makes you think about how we need a more humane approach within the legal system. We have to recognize the immense emotional toll these proceedings can have on people.
It makes you wonder if he had felt more supported during those tough times, if he had felt heard and understood, maybe things would have turned out differently.
It's impossible to say for sure,
Yeah.
but it does raise some important questions about what we can do as a society to prevent this from happening again. How can we create an environment that's more empathetic and supportive for people who are facing these kinds of challenges?
Well, I think it starts with awareness. We have to be more attuned to the signs of mental distress and encourage open conversations about mental health. We need to break down the stigma and create safe spaces where people feel comfortable seeking help.
I completely agree. And along with awareness, we need to make sure there are good mental health resources available and that they're easy to access, not just for people who are in crisis, but for anyone who's struggling or feeling overwhelmed.
It's about having a support system in place that catches people before they fall too far and offers guidance and resources along the way.
Exactly. It's about building a safety net with strong supports, accessible mental health services, supportive communities, and a legal system that's fair and compassionate.
And it's about changing how we view mental health. We need to stop seeing it as a weakness and start seeing it as an essential part of overall well-being. Asking for help should be encouraged and seen as a sign of strength.
I couldn't agree more. It's time to stop whispering about mental health and start talking about it openly and honestly. That's how we break down the barriers and build a more supportive and understanding society.
This deep dive into Atul's story has been really tough, but it's been important to shine a light on these crucial issues. Even though his story is a tragedy, it could be the spark that ignites positive change.
I feel the same way. It's a wake-up call. It's time to look beyond the surface and address the root causes of these tragedies.
We need to turn this tragedy into a catalyst for action. We need to make sure that Atul's story isn't just another statistic, but a turning point in how we approach mental health and support those who need it most. This whole situation has been really hard to process. It feels like we've only just started to understand how complex this issue really is. When you think about mental health and societal pressures and the legal system, It's just a lot to wrap your head around.
You're right, there's so much to unpack here. And I think one of the biggest things we can learn from Atul's story is that these issues are all connected. They don't exist in a vacuum.
It's true. It's like one problem leads to another. Personal struggles turn into legal battles, which just makes the mental health problems worse, and it just keeps spiraling.
Exactly. And when there aren't good support systems in place, it's easy to feel like you're trapped and there's no way out.
Atul's story has really touched a lot of people. I mean, look at how fast it spread on social media. It seems to have hit a nerve. Maybe because so many people feel overwhelmed by life's challenges these days and can relate to what he went through.
You're right. It's a good reminder that behind every headline and every statistic, there are real people who are hurting.
Hmm.
And a lot of times their struggles are invisible to the world.
So this brings us to a really important question. What can we do? How do we move past just talking about the problem and start actually making things better? How do we create a society that's more supportive and empathetic?
Well, I think the first step is to listen. We have to be willing to hear people's stories, to validate their experiences,
Hmm.
and let them know that they're not alone.
It sounds so simple, right? Just listen. But it's amazing how often we forget to do that. Sometimes just letting someone share their pain without judging them can make a huge difference.
It's about creating a safe space for people to talk about their mental health without feeling ashamed or stigmatized.
And besides listening, we need to offer support. Are there specific things we can do to help someone who's struggling?
Absolutely. We can start by learning about the signs of mental distress and how to have those tough conversations in a way that's sensitive and helpful. There are tons of resources out there online and in our communities that can teach us how to be good allies and supporters.
We can also push for better mental health resources in our workplaces and schools and in our communities in general. We need to make sure that anyone who needs help can get it.
Definitely. And we can support organizations that are working to raise awareness about mental health and provide services to people who are struggling.
This deep dive has been a tough one, but it's been so important to have these conversations. Atul's story might be a tragedy, but it's also a wake-up call. It's time to face these issues head-on.
I agree. We can't ignore this anymore. We have to be more aware, more compassionate, and more proactive when it comes to mental health.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final thought. What can you do in your own life to create a more supportive environment for people who are struggling with their mental health? It's something to think about. And even small acts of kindness and understanding can make a real difference. Thank you for joining us for this important conversation.